Hello, everyone. I know many of you listen while falling asleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case. Speedway, Indiana, 1978. A small, quiet town sitting right on the edge of Indianapolis. Best known for the legendary Indianapolis Motor Speedway. For most of the year, Speedway was the kind of place where nothing ever really happened. Neighbors knew each other by name. Kids rode their bikes until dark without their parents worrying. The nights were long and peaceful and ordinary. It was the kind of town where people felt safe, because nothing bad ever happened here. Nothing ever could. On the corner of Crawfordsville Road sat a Burger Chef restaurant. If you grew up in the American Midwest in the 1970s, you remember Burger Chef. Bright, cheerful. The smell of flame-broiled burgers drifting out into cool evening air. It was a wholesome place. A family place. Teenagers worked there after school, saving up for their futures, building their lives one shift at a time. On the evening of Friday, November 17, 1978, the Burger Chef on Crawfordville Road was wrapping up a normal closing shift. The dinner rush had come and gone. The last customers had drifted home. The parking lot sat quiet under the November sky. Inside, a small crew of young people were doing what closing crews always do, wiping down counters, counting registers, bagging trash, turning off the fryers. Tired, ordinary routine work. There were 4 people on that closing shift that night. 4 young people with names and faces and people at home waiting for them. And sometime between 10 o'clock and midnight, all 4 of them vanished. When a manager arrived the next morning to open the restaurant, what he found stopped him cold. The back door was unlocked. The safe had been opened. There was cash missing. Somewhere between $500 and $700 from the night deposit. And the restaurant was completely empty. No crew note. No sign of a struggle in any obvious place. Just an empty building, a missing deposit, and 4 young people who had simply ceased to exist sometime in the night. He stood in that empty kitchen, and he knew. He knew immediately that something was deeply, terribly wrong. Because those 4 employees did not just walk away. They did not forget to close up and go home. Something had happened here. Something had come through that back door in the dark, and it had taken them. Within hours, police were at the scene. Within days, the case had grown into one of the largest criminal investigations in Indiana history. And within 2 days of their disappearance, the bodies of all 4 employees were found, abandoned in the woods, miles from the restaurant in a rural stretch of Johnson County. But despite the scale of the investigation, despite hundreds of suspects interviewed, despite decades of renewed effort, no one has ever been charged with their murders. This is the story of Jane Freet, Daniel Davis, Mark Flemons, and Ruth Ellen Shelton. 4 young people who went to work on a Friday night and never came home. 4 lives stolen in the dark by someone who was never made to answer for what they did. Let me tell you who they were before I tell you what happened to them. Jane Freet was 20 years old. She was the assistant manager on duty that closing shift, which tells you something about her right away. 20 years old and already trusted with real responsibility. Already proving herself. Already the kind of person her employers counted on. People who knew Jane described her with the kind of warmth that only comes when someone has genuinely made a mark on the people around them. She was reliable. She was kind. She had a steadiness to her that made people feel at ease. She was not the loudest person in a room, but she was often the most dependable one. The person who showed up early, stayed late, made sure things were done right. Jane had a future she was working toward. She had people who loved her and were waiting for her to come home that night. Daniel Davis was 16 years old. 16. Still a child in so many ways, still in the middle of becoming whoever he was going to be. Danny, as the people who knew him called him, was a high school student working part-time at Burger Chef the way so many teenagers do, earning a little money, gaining a little independence, stepping carefully into the adult world. He was described as a good kid. Quiet, pleasant, the kind of teenager who made his parents proud in small, everyday ways. He had his whole life him on the evening of November 17, 1978. He had not yet had time to make all the mistakes young people make, to fall in love the way young people fall in love, to figure out who he truly was. He was only 16. Mark Flemons was 17 years old. Another teenager, another young life just beginning to take shape. Mark was described by Newham as friendly and warm. The kind of kid who made people smile, who had an easy energy that drew people to him. He, too, was still in school, still building toward a future that stretched out ahead of him like an open road. 17 years old. The age where everything still feels possible, where the world is still wide open, where the worst thing you can imagine is failing a test or missing curfew. Ruth Ellen Shelton was 18 years old. The eldest of the two youngest, Ruth was a young woman who had recently graduated high school and was figuring out her next steps. The way so many 18-year-olds are, not quite a child anymore, not yet fully settled into adulthood, standing in that in-between space where life is full of possibility and uncertainty in equal measure. She was described as sweet and warm, someone who cared about the people around her, someone who brought a gentle kind of light into the lives of the people who knew her. 18 years old, these four young people. One 20-year-old woman carrying the weight of closing manager responsibility, two teenage boys who should have been thinking about nothing more serious than homework, and a young woman just beginning to find her footing in the world. These four people made up the closing crew at the Burger Chef on Crawfordsville Road on the night of November 17, 1978. Their lives seemed ordinary. Their evening seemed routine. And then something came for them in the dark, and they never had the chance to run. The Burger Chef on Crawfordsville Road was not a complicated place. It was a fast food restaurant like thousands of others across the country, straightforward, functional. The kind of business that hummed along predictably day after day. The staff clocked in, they took orders, they flipped burgers, they counted change, they cleaned up, they went home. There was a rhythm to it, the same rhythm every day, the kind of repetition that makes a place feel safe precisely because nothing ever changes. November in Indiana is cold. The kind of cold that settles in your bones when you step outside, that turns your breath to vapor in the air, that makes you pull your jacket tighter and walk a little faster to your car. By the time a closing shift ended at a place like Burger Chef, sometime around midnight, Crawfordsville Road would have been quiet, traffic thin, the neighborhood dark and still. Just the glow of parking lot lights and the distant hum of the city, and four young people getting ready to lock up and go home. That Friday night, the restaurant closed at its normal time. The last customers left. The crew began the closing routine, the same routine they had done dozens of times before. Cleaning, locking. The things you do at the end of a shift without thinking. Because they are so familiar they have become almost automatic. Jane Freet, as assistant manager, would have been responsible for the night deposit. This was standard procedure. The cash from the register, bagged and counted, taken to the bank's night deposit box. It was a routine task, one that managers handled at the end of every shift. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. Just one more thing to check off before heading home. Somewhere in the course of that closing routine, something went wrong. We do not know exactly when it happened. We do not know exactly how it began. What we know is that sometime between approximately 10 o'clock, when the restaurant officially closed, and sometime before midnight, something came into that Burger Chef. Something or someone that should not have been there. The back door, the door used by staff to come and go during their shifts, showed no signs of forced entry. This detail would haunt investigators for years. No forced entry meant one of two things. Either the person who came through that door had a key, or someone inside let them in, or, and this is the possibility that makes the stomach drop, the door was simply unlocked, left open during the closing routine, and someone walked through it in the dark. Whatever happened in that kitchen, it happened fast enough that no alarm was raised. There were no calls to 911, no screams heard by neighboring businesses, no witnesses who saw anything alarming from the parking lot. The street outside stayed quiet. The night stayed ordinary. And inside the Burger Chef, 4 young people disappeared. The night deposit was missing. The safe had been opened, not forced, not broken into, but opened, which meant either someone knew the combination or someone had been made to give it. between $500 and $700 was gone. This would become one of the central early theories in the investigation, that the burger chef had been robbed, that the 4 employees had been taken or killed as part of that robbery, that this was a crime of opportunity carried out by someone desperate for money. But even in those first hours, experienced investigators looked at what was in front of them and felt something darker. A robbery gone wrong could explain the missing money. It could explain a struggle, a panic, a violent moment that spun out of control. But it could not easily explain why 4 people were taken from the building rather than left at the scene. It could not easily explain the organization it would have taken to move 4 people. 4 people who would have been frightened, resistant, possibly fighting back, out of a restaurant and into the night without anyone seeing or hearing anything at all. This was not a simple robbery. Whatever had happened inside the Burger Chef on Crawfordsville Road on the night of November 17, 1978, it was something more deliberate than that. Something more planned. Something that required more than one person, most investigators believed, to carry out. But those answers would come later. First came the morning, and the discovery, and the terrible realization that 4 young people were gone. The manager who arrived to open the restaurant on Saturday morning, November 18th, noticed immediately that something was wrong. The back door was unlocked. That alone was unusual enough to give him pause. Jane Freet was responsible and thorough. She would not have left the back door unlocked. He stepped inside. The restaurant was dark and quiet in the way that restaurants are quiet when no one is there. A different quiet from the aft-close quiet, heavier somehow, more complete. He moved through the space. The fryers were off. The counters had been partially cleaned. The registers were open. And the night deposit, the bag of cash that should have been on its way to the bank, was gone. But the crew was also gone. No Janie. No Mark. No Ruth. Gone, all of them, without explanation. He called the police. Within a short time, officers arrived at the scene and began the careful, methodical work of trying to understand what had happened. On the surface, the restaurant looked like the scene of a robbery. Missing cash, an open safe, a back door left unlocked. But the absence of the employees nagged at the officers who walked through that space. Where were they? Had they left voluntarily? Had they been taken? If there had been a robbery, why take the employees? Why not simply take the money and run? The investigation that would consume the next several months, and in a different form the next several decades, had begun. And then, 2 days after they vanished, the bodies were found. On Monday, November 20th, 1978, 2 days after the Burger Chef employees failed to come home, a hunter walking through a rural stretch of Johnson County, approximately 30 miles south of Speedway, came across something in the woods that made him stop and stare, and reach for whatever composure he could hold on to. He had found them. All 4 of them, in the same general area in the woods off a rural road. Their bodies had been left there. In the cold November air, under bare trees and a gray sky, as though whoever had done this had simply driven them out here and left them like they were nothing. Like they had never mattered. Like 4 young lives were simply things to be discarded in the dark. Jane Freet, Daniel Davis, Mark Flemons, Ruth Ellen Shelton. The cause of death varied between the victims, a detail that told investigators something significant and deeply disturbing about what had happened. Jane Freet and Ruth Ellen Shelton had been shot. Danny Davis had been stabbed. Mark Flemons showed signs of blunt force trauma and had been strangled. The variation in cause of death suggested chaos, suggested multiple perpetrators possibly, suggested a situation that had escalated in different directions with different victims. It was not the clean, quick work of a single person with a clear plan. It was something messier, something more violent and disorganized, something that had involved real struggle and real terror in those final moments. The medical examiner worked carefully over each victim, gathering whatever the bodies could tell him about what had happened in those missing hours between Friday night and Monday morning. Time of death was estimated to be sometime in the early hours of Saturday morning, not long then after the restaurant had closed. Whatever had happened inside the Burger Chef, whatever had been done to these 4 young people, it had likely happened quickly. within hours of the last customer walking out the door. There was evidence that at least some of the victims had been alive for a period of time after they were taken from the restaurant. There were indications of restraint, of movement, of a journey taken under terrible circumstances before the end came. The thought of it, of those 4 young people, frightened and bound and in the hands of whoever had taken them, driven through the Indiana night with no way to call for help, no way to escape, no way to know how it would end, is almost unbearable to sit with. But we have to sit with it, because this is what happened to them. This is what was done to Jane and Danny and Mark and Ruth on a cold November night in 1978, and the least we can do, all these years later, is bear witness to it. To say their names, to refuse to let them be forgotten. The discovery of the 4 bodies transformed the investigation overnight. What had begun as a missing persons case and a potential robbery was now a quadruple homicide, one of the most serious crimes in Indiana's recent history. The Indiana State Police took the lead, working alongside local law enforcement, and the full weight of the investigative machinery began to turn toward finding whoever had done this. Detectives descended on the Burger chef. The restaurant was closed and treated as a crime scene, examined inch by inch for whatever evidence had survived. The woods in Johnson County were searched carefully. The area around the bodies mapped and documented. Witnesses were sought, anyone who had been near Crawfordsville Road on the night of November 17th, anyone who had seen a vehicle, anyone who had noticed anything unusual. Tips began pouring in almost immediately, because that is what happens when something this terrible occurs in a small community. Everyone wants to help. Everyone has something they think might matter. The investigation would ultimately involve hundreds of tips, dozens of suspects, and years of sustained effort. It would touch on the darkest corners of 1970s criminal culture in Indiana. It would generate theories ranging from the straightforward to the elaborate. And it would, despite everything, end without a conviction, without a definitive answer, without justice for 4 young people who deserved so much better. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let me take you back to those first days, to the beginning of an investigation that started with almost nothing and would eventually become everything. The detectives who first walked through the Burger chef on November 18, 1978 were experienced officers, people who had seen crime scenes before and knew how to look at one without letting emotion cloud their professional assessment. But even for them, this scene carried a particular weight, because the people who were missing from this restaurant were not strangers. They were kids. They were somebody's children, somebody's siblings, somebody's friends. And they were gone, and nobody yet knew where. And that uncertainty, that gap between the empty restaurant and whatever had actually happened, was its own specific kind of horror. What the detectives saw when they examined the scene was a restaurant that had been partially, but not completely, cleaned at the end of the shift. The counters showed work in progress. The cleaning had been interrupted, which suggested the intrusion had happened while the closing routine was still underway, not after it was complete. This was significant. It meant the perpetrator or perpetrators had arrived while the crew was still working, while there were still tasks to be done, while the rhythm of closing was still in motion. The back door showed no signs of forced entry, as we have established. The safe had been opened rather than broken into. The cash from the night deposit was missing. These details pointed towards someone with either inside knowledge of the restaurant's operations or the ability to force someone on the crew to cooperate, to give up the combination, to open the safe, to hand over the deposit bag. The register drawers had been opened and examined. Whatever cash had been in them had been taken. The total amount missing, as best as investigators could estimate, was somewhere between $500 and $700. In 1978, that was a meaningful amount of money, not a fortune, but enough to be worth something to someone who needed it badly enough. Enough to kill for, if that was the kind of person you were. Detectives looked for fingerprints. They looked for footprints. They looked for anything that had been left behind by whoever had been there, any trace of the intruder or intruders in the spaces they had moved through. The forensic technology of 1978 was a different world from what investigators have access to today. No DNA analysis, Limited fingerprint databases, no digital records to subpoena, no cell phone data to pull. What they had was physical evidence, witness testimony, and the accumulated experience of trained investigators trying to read a scene and understand what it was telling them. What the scene told them in those early hours was this: something organized had happened here. Someone had come to this restaurant with a purpose. The employees had not been left behind. They had been taken, all four of them, which required either multiple perpetrators or an extraordinary degree of control over four frightened young people. They had been moved, transported from the restaurant to a location 30 miles away, and they had been killed, not in a single uniform way, but in multiple ways that suggested a chaotic and violent scene. The question that hung over everything, the question that would take months and years to even partially address, was simple: who? Who came through that back door on a cold November night? Who took four young people from their workplace and drove them into the dark and killed them and left them in the woods? Who walked away from that restaurant with $500 and four lives on their hands, and then disappeared back into the ordinary world as though nothing had happened? That question, even now, does not have a definitive answer, but the investigation came agonizingly close more than once to finding one. The community of Speedway did not take the murders quietly. How could they? Four young people, children, really in the case of the teenagers, had been taken from a place that was supposed to be safe and killed in the dark. The town that had always felt protected, that had always felt apart from the violence of bigger, harder places, had been violated in the most direct and terrible way possible. The sense of security that small-town life provides, that feeling of knowing your neighbors and trusting your streets, all of it had been shattered in a single night. Parents pulled their teenagers from closing shifts at fast food restaurants across the area. Other restaurants changed their policies, requiring employees to call in when they left for the night, adding extra security measures that had never seemed necessary before. The Burger Chef on Crawfordsville Road stayed closed. The investigation continued, its windows dark, its parking lot empty. A monument to what had happened there. People talked about it everywhere. At church, at the grocery store, at school drop-off lines and neighborhood barbecues. Everyone had a theory. Everyone had heard something, or knew someone who had heard something, or had seen a car parked somewhere unusual on the night of the 17th. The tip lines rang constantly. Detectives worked through their days and into their nights trying to follow every lead, trying to find the thread that would unravel this and reveal whoever was responsible. The victims' families were living through something that no family should ever have to endure. The particular horror of losing a child, or a sibling, or a friend, to violence is one thing. But losing them to unexplained violence, to a crime with no immediate answer, no clear perpetrator, no moment of arrest and accountability that allows grief to begin shifting towards some kind of closure, that is a different and in some ways even more devastating experience. The families of Jane and Danny and Mark and Ruth did not just lose their loved ones. They lost them in a way that left questions burning, that kept the wound open, that made it impossible to fully grieve, because there was always still the hope, or the torment, of an answer just around the corner. Jane Freet's family remembered her as the kind of daughter who made you proud every day. Not in dramatic, showy ways, but in the quiet, consistent ways that matter most, showing up, working hard, caring about the people around her. She had been working at Burger Chef for long enough to earn real responsibility, and she had not taken that responsibility lightly. She was 20 years old, which is so young, and yet she had already developed the character that people spend their whole lives trying to build. Her family would spend years, decades, holding on to the hope that someone would one day be made to answer for what had been done to her. Danny Davis was 16, and his parents' grief was the grief of parents who have lost a child who was still becoming, still forming, still so far from the end of what his life should have been. He had been working at Burger Chef, as many teenagers do, for the independence of it, for the money of it, for the small but real satisfaction of having a job and doing it well. He had not done anything to deserve what happened to him. He had simply shown up for work on a Friday night, the way responsible teenagers do, the way his parents had raised him to do. And that was the last time anyone saw him alive. Mark Flemons was 17, and the people who knew him spoke about him with the kind of warmth that tells you everything you need to know about what a person was like. Friendly, warm. The kind of kid who made a room feel a little lighter just by being in it. 17 years old. A junior in high school or close to it. A young man with everything still ahead of him. With a whole life waiting to be lived that was taken away in the dark on a November night for reasons that never fully made sense and were never fully explained. Ruth Ellen Shelton was 18. Old enough that her family perhaps thought the worst of the dangerous years were behind her. Old enough to be considered an adult in most of the ways that matter, and yet still so young, still so new to the world. She had been at Burger Chef that night doing what young people do when they are figuring out their next steps, working, saving, taking life one day at a time. She had plans, even if those plans were not yet fully formed. She had a future she was moving toward. And then she did not. These 4 young people. These 4 lives. This is who was taken from the Burger Chef on Crawfordsville Road on the night of November 17, 1978. And now the investigation had to find whoever had taken them. 4:04 p.m. The detectives working the Burger Chef case in those first weeks knew they were racing against something. Not just time, though time mattered. Evidence degrades, memories fade, witnesses move on. They were racing against the particular entropy of a case with no immediate, obvious suspect. No name written on the wall. No witness who had seen a face clearly enough to describe it. No fingerprint that matched anything in the limited databases of 1978. Just a restaurant, a missing deposit, 4 bodies in the woods, and a community demanding answers that the investigators did not yet have. The Indiana State Police assembled a dedicated task force. This was not a case that could be handled by a small team working regular hours. The scale of it, the public attention it had drawn, the sheer number of tips coming in through the phone lines demanded a larger, more organized response. Detectives were assigned specifically to the Burger Chef murders and nothing else. Their entire professional focus, day after day, was this case. Finding whoever had walked through that back door. Finding whoever had loaded 4 young people into a vehicle and driven them 30 miles south into Johnson County and killed them in the dark. In those early weeks, the leads came in waves. The first and most obvious avenue of investigation was the restaurant itself. Investigators looked hard at everyone connected to the Burger Chef on Crawfordsville Road. Current employees, former employees, managers, anyone who had worked there long enough to know the closing routines, to know how the safe worked, to know what time the crew would be finishing up on a Friday night. Inside knowledge had to be considered. The back door had not been forced. The safe had been opened without being broken. Someone had known things about that restaurant that a random stranger walking past would not have known. Employees were interviewed one by one carefully. Their movements on the night of November 17th were traced and verified where possible. Alibi after alibi was checked. Most held up. A few required additional scrutiny. The investigators moved methodically through the list, eliminating names, narrowing the field, looking for the person or persons whose account of the evening did not quite line up, whose alibi had a gap, whose behavior in the days since the murders had been somehow off. Former employees were also examined. Someone who worked at the Burger Chef in the past, who knew the layout, knew the routines, knew when the closing crew would be alone and vulnerable, was a credible suspect category. The restaurant had been operating for long enough to have cycled through a significant number of staff. Each former employee represented a potential thread to pull. At the same time, investigators were working the physical evidence from the scene in Johnson County, where the bodies had been found. The rural road, the patch of woods, the specific location where 4 young people had been left, all of it was examined for what it could tell about the person, or people who had brought them there. Did the location suggest local knowledge? Someone who knew this particular stretch of rural Johnson County, who knew that this road was quiet and remote and unlikely to see traffic in the small hours of a November morning? Or was it simply a random choice, made by someone driving south on a highway, turning off at an exit that looked isolated enough, making a desperate decision in the dark? The road itself was canvassed. Neighbors within range were interviewed. Anyone who might have heard a vehicle on that road in the early hours of Saturday morning, November 18th, was asked about it. A car pulling off a rural road in the middle of the night, in the cold. In the dark, would anyone have noticed? Would anyone have looked out a window and seen headlights where headlights should not be? A few people had seen things, or thought they had. The tips that came in from the area around the Johnson County site were examined carefully, sorted into categories of credibility, followed up on with varying degrees of urgency. Some led somewhere useful, others led nowhere at all. The forensic work on the victims' bodies had yielded important information, though the limitations of 1978 technology meant that some of what the bodies could tell was beyond the investigators' ability to fully read. The variation in cause of death: Jane and Ruth shot, Danny stabbed, Mark strangled and subjected to blunt force trauma, was one of the most significant and puzzling aspects of the physical evidence. It raised questions that investigators turned over and over in their minds. Why had the victims died in different ways? A single perpetrator working alone would most naturally use a single method, a gun, or a knife, or some other weapon they had brought with them. The variation suggested either multiple perpetrators, who had each dealt with different victims in their own way, or a single perpetrator who had lost or discarded one weapon and moved to another, or a scene of considerable chaos in which improvised violence had been applied differently to different victims depending on the circumstances of the moment. The presence of a firearm was significant. Someone had brought a gun to the burger chef that night, or had a gun with them when they encountered the employees. In 1978, this was not as immediately unusual as it might seem in some contexts. Firearms were common in Indiana, particularly in rural and working-class communities. But it was still a meaningful detail, a piece of information that helped sketch the outline of whoever had done this. The stab wounds on Danny Davis told a slightly different story. A knife was a more personal weapon than a gun, more intimate, in a terrible way, requiring closer proximity and more direct physical contact with the victim. The combination of a firearm and a blade suggested either two perpetrators with different weapons or a single perpetrator, whose approach had shifted during the course of events that night. Mark Flemons had been strangled and beaten, signs of a struggle, of physical contact that went beyond a weapon and became something more brutal and direct. The thought of what those final moments must have been like for him, fighting back, perhaps, or trying to, against someone determined to end his life, is almost impossible to dwell on without feeling a profound and helpless grief. Investigators pieced together what they could from the forensic evidence and constructed a working theory of the night's events. Someone, likely more than one person, had entered the burger chef after closing or during the final stages of the closing routine. They had either used a key, been let in, or taken advantage of an unlocked door. They had confronted the crew. They had taken the night deposit and the cash from the registers. And then, for reasons that were either logistical or coldly deliberate, they had not left the employees behind. They had taken them. The taking of the employees was the detail that most deeply disturbed experienced investigators. In a robbery, you take the money and you go. You might threaten the people on the premises. You might even hurt them if they resist or if you panic. But you do not typically load 4 people into a vehicle and drive them 30 miles into the countryside. That takes time. That takes planning, or at least improvisation on a significant scale. That takes a level of control over 4 frightened people that is not easy to achieve unless you are organized, unless you are multiple people, unless you have established dominance over the situation in a way that makes resistance seem impossible. Why were they taken? Investigators considered multiple possibilities. The most straightforward was witness elimination. The employees had seen the perpetrators' faces and could identify them, and so they could not be left alive at the scene. This theory assumed that the perpetrators were known to at least some of the crew, or had been seen clearly enough to be described to police. It assumed a cold calculation, a decision made in that kitchen or sometime shortly after, that these 4 young people were a liability that had to be eliminated. Another possibility was that the taking of the employees had not been planned at all. that it had been a panicked decision made in the moment by people who had not anticipated what would happen and did not know how to manage the situation they had created. In this version, the perpetrators had gone to the burger chef intending only robbery, but something had gone wrong. Someone had reacted unexpectedly. A moment of violence had escalated, and now they were standing in a kitchen with 4 witnesses and a dead or injured person and no good options. Taking everyone with them and driving away was not a plan so much as a desperate attempt to buy time, to get away from the scene and figure out what to do next. The truth, investigators suspected, was probably somewhere in between. Planned enough to acquire a weapon, to know when the restaurant would be closing and the crew'd be vulnerable, to have transportation ready. Chaotic enough that the violence had taken multiple forms, that 4 different people had died in 4 different ways, that the whole thing had the feel of something that had spiraled beyond whatever original intention had set it in motion. In those first weeks, a significant portion of the investigation's energy was devoted to a specific category of suspect people with criminal records, particularly for robbery or violent crime, who had been active in the Indianapolis area in the fall of 1978. The profile that was emerging: multiple perpetrators, armed robbery that escalated to murder, victims transported from the crime scene, fit a pattern that experienced detectives associated with certain types of criminals. Not random violent offenders. Not people who had committed one desperate act and never would again. But people who moved through the criminal world with some regularity, who were known to law enforcement, who had done things like this before, or who moved in circles where things like this happened. The Indianapolis criminal landscape in the late 1970s was not as organized or as visible as organized crime in larger cities, but it had its own networks, its own hierarchies, its own cast of characters known to police. Investigators began working through those networks, pulling names, checking records, asking questions in places and of people who were not accustomed to cooperating with law enforcement. Tips continued to pour in. Some were credible enough to generate immediate follow-up. A person seen near the burger chef that night, a vehicle noticed on the rural road in Johnson County, someone overheard saying something that, in the aftermath of the murders, suddenly seemed deeply significant. Others were the product of grief and community fear, neighbors pointing fingers at people they had never quite trusted, people calling in the names of ex-boyfriends and estranged relatives and difficult neighbors, the noise that always accompanies a case that captures a community's terror. Each tip had to be taken seriously. Each one had to be followed up, verified or dismissed, filed and documented. The sheer volume and information flowing into the investigation was, in its own way, one of the investigation's greatest challenges. More information does not always mean closer to the truth. Sometimes it means more distance from it, more false paths to walk down before finding the real one. One of the earliest and most significant investigative threads concerned a question of the night deposit. The deposit had been prepared. The cash had been counted, bagged, made ready for the bank run that was part of the closing routine. This suggested that the robbery had occurred after the closing work was substantially complete, or at least after the register count had been done. Someone had known when to come. Someone had timed their arrival to coincide with the moment when the cash was ready to be taken. This, more than anything else in the early evidence, pointed toward inside knowledge. You do not time a robbery this precisely based on general assumptions about when fast food restaurants close. You need to know the specific routine of this specific restaurant, when the registers are counted, when the deposit is bagged, when the crew is at their most vulnerable. That kind of knowledge comes from proximity, from someone who had worked there, or someone who had been told about it by someone who worked there, or someone who had spent enough time watching the place to understand its rhythms. This led investigators back to the employees themselves, not as suspects, of course, but as potential unwitting links to whoever had done this. Had any of them talked, innocently, to someone who had turned out to be dangerous? Had any of them mentioned the closing routine, the safe combination, the timing of the night deposit, to someone they trusted who should not have been trusted? It was not an accusation. It was a question that had to be asked, because every possible explanation had to be considered. The interviews with friends and family of the victims were painful and delicate. Investigators were dealing with people in the acute phase of grief, people who had just lost a child or a sibling or a friend in the most terrible way imaginable. And they were asking these people to think carefully, to remember conversations and contacts and details that might help explain how this had happened. Most people wanted to help. Most people would have done anything to help find whoever was responsible. But grief does not make memory clearer. It often makes it foggier, more unreliable, harder to navigate. Nothing in those early interviews with the victims' families pointed immediately to a clear perpetrator. No one had been threatened. No one had reported anything unusual in the days or weeks before November 17th. The 4 employees had not, as far as anyone knew, been targeted specifically. They had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, working a closing shift that someone had decided to exploit. The weeks passed, and the investigation continued to expand rather than narrow. More tips, more interviews. More names added to the list of people who needed to be looked at, spoken to, checked out. The Indiana State Police were methodical and professional, but they were also quietly growing frustrated. The case that had seemed in those first terrible days like it might be solved quickly, because surely something this violent, this visible, would leave tracks, was proving to be more elusive than anyone had hoped. By the end of 1978, no arrest had been made. The new year came and the investigation continued. The community of Speedway had not forgotten, could not forget, but the acute, all-consuming panic of the immediate aftermath had settled into something longer and lower, a persistent grief and unease that became part of the background of daily life in the town. Parents still worried about their teenagers. Fast food restaurants in the area had adjusted their closing procedures and added security measures that had not existed before. The Burger Chef on Crawford eventually reopened, life, as it always does, pressing forward even when justice has not yet arrived. And then, in the months and years that followed, the investigation produced something it had been searching for from the beginning: suspects. Not one, not a simple, clean answer, but a complex and layered accumulation of people who, for various reasons, found themselves in the crosshairs of an investigation, trying to make sense of a crime that seemed designed to resist sense-making. The first major suspect category was the one that investigators had been working from the beginning: people with criminal records and connections to robbery in the Indianapolis area. Over the course of the investigation, a number of individuals in this category were identified, interviewed, and subjected to various degrees of scrutiny. Some were eliminated relatively quickly. Others lingered longer in the investigation's orbit, their names returning again and again as new information surfaced or old information was re-examined. One of the threads that investigators pursued with particular intensity concerned a group of individuals who had been involved in a series of armed robberies in the Indianapolis area in the period surrounding the Burger Chef murders. Armed robbery was the working theory for the motive behind what had happened at the Burger Chef, and so people who were known to commit armed robberies were a natural focus. If the same people who had robbed other businesses in the area had also robbed the Burger Chef, and if that robbery had escalated into murder, then there should be connections, overlaps, traces that could link them to the Crawfordsville Road restaurant. The problem was that armed robbery was not a rare crime in Indianapolis in 1978, and there was no shortage of individuals who fit the general profile. Investigators had to make judgments about which threads were worth following most intensely, which suspects deserved the most scrutiny, which pieces of information were genuinely pointing toward the truth and which were noise. There were people who were brought in for questioning and released. There were people who remained persons of interest for years. There were people whose names surfaced and then sank, and then there's the investigation moved through its various phases. And then there was a development that, for a time, seemed like it might finally be the breakthrough the investigation had been waiting for. In the early 1980s, a man named Donald Forrester came to the attention of investigators. Forrester was a convicted criminal with a history of violent offenses, and information that surfaced connected him, at least theoretically, to the events of November 17, 1978. His name was not the first to surface in the investigation, and it would not be the last. But the information that linked him to the case was specific enough to generate serious attention. The details of what investigators believed they had on Forrester were never fully made public. This is characteristic of the Burger Chef investigation more broadly, which was conducted with a degree of secrecy that frustrated journalists and true crime researchers for decades. What is known is that Forrester was seriously considered as a suspect, that the investigation devoted significant resources to examining his possible involvement, and that ultimately the case against him did not come together in a way that resulted in charges. Forrester would not be the last person to occupy that uncomfortable middle space between serious suspect and unindicted individual. The Burger Chef investigation would generate a number of people in exactly that position over the years, people investigated seriously, people about whom investigators had significant suspicions, people whose possible involvement was taken seriously enough to be documented and pursued, but who were never formally charged. This pattern, the pattern of suspects identified and then not charged, is one of the most painful and defining features of the Burger Chef case. It is what makes the case a true cold case in the deepest sense, not a case with no suspects, not a case with no evidence, but a case where the evidence that exists has never been sufficient to bring anyone to a courtroom and hold them accountable. But let us not get ahead of the story. Because the most significant and extensively investigated suspect in the Burger Chef case did not emerge until years into the investigation, and their story is complicated enough to require its own careful telling. For now, let us stay in those early years, 1980-1981, when the investigation was still active and urgent, when the families of the victims were still holding their breath and hoping, when the detectives working the case were still running down leads and following threads, and refusing to let the file go cold. There were moments of apparent progress. Moments when a tip came in that seemed credible and specific, when an informant provided information that seemed to fit, when a name surfaced with enough attached detail to generate real excitement in the task force. And each time, the excitement would build and then deflate, as the new information failed to solidify into something that could support a prosecution. The frustration among investigators was real. The frustration among the victims' families was profound and consuming. They had been promised, in the way that law enforcement always promises, that justice would be served, that whoever had done this would be found and held accountable. And year after year that promise went unfulfilled. By the mid-1980s, the active phase of the investigation had wound down. The task force that had been assembled in the immediate aftermath of the murders was no longer dedicated exclusively to the Burger Chef case. Other crimes had happened. Other investigations required resources. The world had moved on in the way the world always moves on, even when justice has not been served. Even when 4 young people are still waiting for someone to stand up in a courtroom and be held responsible for what was done to them. The case file remained open. It always remained open. The Indiana State Police never officially closed the Burger Chef investigation, never declared it unsolvable, never stopped accepting tips. Periodically, over the years and decades that followed, the case would receive a fresh infusion of attention, a new detective assigned to review the file, a journalist writing a retrospective, a tip that came in from someone who had been carrying a piece of information for years and finally decided to share it. Each renewal of attention brought the families of the victims back to a place of hope and heartbreak simultaneously. Hope, because maybe this time, maybe this new detective, this new technology, this new tip would be the thing that finally unlocked the case. Heartbreak, because each renewal was also a reminder of how long it had been, how many years had passed, how far they still were from the answer they needed. And then, in the 1990s, the investigation found a new direction. A direction that would, ultimately, bring the Burger Chef case closer to resolution than it had ever come, and then stop just short of the finish line in a way that was almost more painful than the decades of uncertainty that had preceded it. It began, as so many cold case breakthroughs do, with a confession. Not a confession in an interrogation room, not a confession to police, but something that functioned like a statement, made by someone who claimed to have knowledge of what had happened at the Burger Chef on Crawfordsville Road, that contained enough specific detail to demand serious attention. The name that emerged from this new direction was one that had not been prominently featured in the investigation's earlier phases. A man who had been living his life, apparently untroubled by what he had done or what he knew, for more than a decade after 4 young people had been murdered in the woods of Johnson County. His name, and the details of his connection to the case, would reshape the entire investigation, and the story of how investigators tried to build a case against him, and how that case ultimately failed to reach a courtroom, is one of the most compelling and devastating chapters in the long, unresolved history of the Burger Chef murders. But before we get there, I want to take a moment to step back from the investigation and return to the victims. Because in all of this, the forensics, the suspects, the tip lines, the theories, it is easy to lose sight of who this is really about. Not the detectives, not the suspects, not the case as an abstract exercise in criminal investigation, but 4 young people who went to work on a Friday night in November 1978 and were robbed of every day that came after. Jane Fright would have been in her mid-60s now. She might have had children, grandchildren perhaps. She might have built a career she was proud of, fallen in love, traveled, grown into the fullness of herself in all the ways that 20-year-olds are still in the process of becoming. She was 20 years old when she died, which means that the 50-plus years she should have had, decades of life, of experience, of whatever joy and sorrow the world would have brought her, were taken from her in a cold parking lot in Johnson County. Danny Davis was 16. 16-year-olds do not yet who they are going to be. They are still in the middle of figuring it out. Danny never got to figure it out. He never got to grow up, never got to become a man, never got to make the mistakes and the discoveries and the connections that turn a teenager into an adult. He was robbed of all of it before he had a chance to begin. Mark Flemons was 17, a year older than Danny, but still so young, still so far from the end of what should have been a long life. His warmth and friendliness, the qualities that people who knew him remembered most clearly, were qualities he should have been able to carry into decades of friendships, of relationships, of a life lived among people who valued him. Instead, those qualities ended in a patch of woods in Johnson County on a cold November night. Ruth Ellen Shelton was 18. She had recently graduated high school, which is to say she had just completed one chapter of her life, and was standing at the beginning of the next one. That next chapter never came. The future that 18-year-olds stand at the edge of, full of possibility and uncertainty, and the particular excitement of not yet knowing what comes next, was taken from her before she had a chance to step into it. 4 lives, 4 futures, 4 families left behind with grief does not diminish with time. That becomes in some ways more concentrated as the years pass, and the absence becomes permanent and undeniable. The hole in the word left by a murdered person does not close. It becomes a fixture, something you learn to live around, something that shapes every birthday and holiday and ordinary Tuesday afternoon for the rest of your life. This is what the Burger Chef murders left behind. Not just a case file, not just an investigation, but 4 holes in the world that have never been filled, and a community that has never fully recovered from the night it discovered that safety is not guaranteed, that evil can come through an unlocked door, that sometimes the terrible thing happens right here, right at home to people you know and love. The 1990s arrived, and with them came something the Burger Chef investigation had been starving for since the very beginning: a name attached to specific knowledge. A person who knew things that only someone connected to the crime could know. A thread that, when investigators began pulling it, seemed finally to lead somewhere real. It started, as so many cold case developments do, not with a dramatic breakthrough in a laboratory or a sudden confession to police, but with the quieter, messier reality of criminal networks unraveling from within. People who commit violent crimes rarely exist in isolation. They exist in worlds where other people know things, where information gets passed between people, where someone told someone else, where a moment of confession or boasting or drunken disclosure, planted a seed that eventually grew into something an investigator could work with. The information that came in during the early 1990s pointed investigators toward a man named James Herb Vance. Vance was not an unknown quantity to Indiana law enforcement. He had a criminal history, a background that placed him squarely within the category of individuals who had been on investigators' radar since the earliest days of the Burger Chef investigation. But what made the 1990s development different from the earlier suspicions that had attached to various names over the years was the specificity of what was now being alleged. This was not a general sense that Vance was the kind of person who might have done something like this. This was specific information, from a source with apparent knowledge, that connected Vance directly to the events of November 17, 1978. The source of this information was another criminal, someone who had been in Vance's orbit. Someone who claimed to have heard Vance speak about the Burger Chef murders in a way that went beyond what any ordinary person would know. The details that this source provided were striking in their specificity. Not the kind of details that someone could have assembled for newspaper coverage of the case. Details that seemed to come from someone who had been there, or who had been told by someone who had been there. Investigators took this information seriously. Seriously enough to open a new phase of the investigation, to assign fresh resources to the case, to begin the painstaking work of trying to corroborate what the source was telling them, and build something that could support a prosecution. James Herb Vance was by this point a man with a long and documented criminal history. He had been in and out of the legal system for years, accumulating charges and convictions and incarcerations that told the story of a life lived at the edges of the law and frequently beyond them. He was the kind of person that experienced investigators recognized. Not always the most visible criminal, not always the most dramatic, but the kind of persistent, dangerous presence that existed in the spaces where ordinary life and criminal activity overlapped. The investigators working the renewed Burger Chef case began building a picture of Vance, where he had been in November 1978, who he had been with, what his connections to the Crawfordsville Road area looked like, whether there was any physical evidence that could place him at the scene or link him to the victims, or to the location in Johnson County, where the bodies had been found. What they found was suggestive but not conclusive. Vance had been in the Indianapolis area in November 1978. He had connections to individuals who fit the profile of potential co-conspirators. There were aspects of his history that aligned with the working theory of the crime, the armed robbery background, the capacity for violence, the existence within criminal networks that might have produced inside knowledge about the Burger Chef's closing routines. But criminal history and general alignment with a profile are not evidence of a specific crime. What investigators needed was something more direct, a physical link, a corroborating witness, something that could put Vance inside that Burger Chef on the night of November 17, 1978, or inside the vehicle that transported 4 terrified people to their deaths in Johnson County. The investigation pressed forward. More witnesses were sought. More informants were cultivated. The information that had initially surfaced was examined from every angle, tested for reliability, checked against the known facts of the case. Investigators were careful, methodical, aware that the stakes were enormous, both in terms of the possibility of finally achieving justice for 4 murdered young people, and in terms of the very real danger of charging the wrong person in a case that had been waiting for resolution for more than a decade. And then the investigation encountered something that would define the Burger Chef case for the rest of its history, the confession of Alita Sims. Alita Sims was a woman who came forward with information that she claimed to have direct, first-hand knowledge of. She said she had been present, or connected to events, on the night of November 17, 1978. She said she knew what had happened at the Burger Chef. And the information she provided, the details she offered about the crime, the victims, the perpetrators, the sequence of events, was extraordinary in its specificity and in its apparent alignment with facts that had never been made public. Investigators listened to Alita Sims very carefully. What she described was a night of violence that had begun as a robbery and spiraled into something far worse. She provided a sequence of events, She provided the kind of granular, textured detail that is almost impossible to fabricate, the kind of detail that tends to come from someone who was actually there, or who heard it from someone who was. The names she provided included James Herb Vance, and they included at least one other individual who had not previously been prominently featured in the investigation. Together, the picture she painted was of a small group of people who had descended on the burger chef that night with robbery in mind, who had encountered complications, whose plan had unraveled in ways that led to 4 deaths, in her telling were not all equally premeditated. The complication, of course, was Alida Sims herself, because a witness who claims first-hand knowledge of a crime is not automatically a reliable witness. Her own role in the events of that night was ambiguous. Her motivations for coming forward when she did, years after the fact, required examination. Her credibility as a witness, particularly given her own background and circumstances, had to be assessed carefully against the information she was providing. This is one of the great recurring tensions of cold case investigations. The witnesses who tend to have the most direct knowledge of violent crimes are often people who are themselves implicated in those crimes, or who exist in the same criminal worlds as the perpetrators, or who have their own complicated reasons for speaking and their own complicated relationships with the truth. A witness like Alida Sims is simultaneously the most valuable kind of source, someone who claims to have been there, and the most problematic kind of source, because her testimony alone, without corroboration, would be enormously difficult to take into a courtroom and make stick. Investigators worked to corroborate what Sims was telling them. They went back to the physical evidence. They went back to the forensic record. They tried to find the places where her account could be checked against things that were already known, things that could be verified independently, things that would either support or undermine her credibility. Some of what she said checked out. Some of the details she provided aligned with facts about the case that had not been publicly released, the specific details that investigators had held back over the years precisely for this purpose, to serve as a test of whether a potential witness had genuine knowledge, or was simply constructing a plausible story from public information. But some of what she said was harder to verify, and some of it raised questions that investigators found difficult to resolve. The picture that emerged from weeks and months of careful examination was one of a witness who appeared to have genuine knowledge of the crime, but whose account had enough complexity and ambiguity that building a prosecution solely on her testimony would be enormous risk. This is the point in the Burger Chef investigation where it came closest to resolution, and also the point where the obstacles became most painfully clear. The central figure that investigators were working toward charging was James Herb Vance. The evidence against him, the informant information from the early 1990s, the details provided by Alida Sims, the circumstantial connections between Vance's history and the specifics of the Burger Chef crime, had accumulated to a point where investigators believed, with a significant degree of confidence, that Vance had been involved in what happened on November 17, 1978. But belief, even well-founded belief, is not the legal standard required for a murder conviction. Prosecutors needed evidence that could be presented to a jury, evidence that could withstand cross-examination, evidence that left no reasonable doubt. And the evidence they had, while significant, had enough gaps and vulnerabilities to make a prosecution deeply uncertain. There was the question of physical evidence. In 1978, the forensic technology available to investigators had not been capable of preserving or analyzing certain types of evidence that modern techniques could work with. DNA analysis, which would become the gold standard of criminal forensics in the 1990s and beyond, had not existed in 1978. What physical evidence had been collected from the scene at the restaurant and from the bodies of the victims had been processed and stored according to the standards of the time, standards that were not always compatible with the more sophisticated analysis that later became possible. Investigators in the 1990s went back to the physical evidence with fresh eyes and new tools. They looked at what remained, what had been preserved, what could now be tested using techniques that had not been available when the evidence was first collected. The results were, in some ways, encouraging there were samples that could be analyzed, material that had been preserved well enough to yield information. But the specific results of that new analysis did not produce the definitive physical link that investigators needed to anchor the case against Vance. This is one of the cruel ironies of cold case investigations. Cases that were committed before the era of DNA evidence sometimes yield to modern forensic analysis, and when they do, the results can be both powerful and decisive. But sometimes the physical evidence that exists is not sufficient, or not well enough preserved, or not directly linked to the suspect in the way that forensic analysis requires to be useful in a prosecution. The burger chef case fell somewhere in the difficult middle ground. New analysis was possible, but the results did not produce the breakthrough that was needed. There was also the question of witnesses. Alita Sims remained the most significant potential witness, but her credibility issues were real and could not simply be set aside. A defense attorney representing James Herb Vance, or any other defendant in a burger chef murder trial, would have worked ferociously to undermine her testimony, to present her as unreliable, self-interested, possibly even fabricating or distorting her account to serve her own purposes. Without strong corroborating evidence to support what she was saying, her testimony alone was unlikely to be enough to secure a conviction. Other witnesses had come forward over the years, people with smaller pieces of information, people who had seen or heard things that seemed relevant. Some of these witnesses had their own credibility issues. Some had information that was difficult to place in the timeline with precision. Some were willing to speak to investigators but nervous about testifying in court, nervous about what it would mean to be publicly identified as someone who had information about the burger chef murders, nervous about the implications for their own safety. Witness fear is a real and persistent obstacle in cases involving violent crime, particularly cases involving perpetrators who are still alive and potentially still dangerous. A witness who has information about a murder committed by someone capable of murder has rational reasons to be afraid of what happens if that person learns they have talked. The investigation continued to work through these obstacles, trying to find pathways around the problems that blocked a prosecution. Different strategies were considered. Different legal approaches were examined. Prosecutors and investigators had conversations about what could be done, about whether the evidence, taken in its totality, was sufficient to support a charge. And then, in a development that cast a long shadow over the entire enterprise, James Herb Vance died. The exact timing and circumstances of Vance's death are part of the case record, but the impact on the investigation was immediate and devastating. The central suspect, the man whom investigators had spent years building a case against, the man whose name appeared at the center of the more accounts of what had happened at the burger chef, was gone. Whatever evidence existed against him, whatever case might eventually have been assembled, could no longer result in a prosecution of James Herb Vance. He had taken with him, in whatever form it existed in his own knowledge and memory, the truth of what had happened on November 17, 1978. For the families of the victims, this was a blow of almost incomprehensible magnitude. Years of hoping, of following the case's developments, of waiting for the moment when someone would finally be held accountable. And now the person investigators believed most responsible had died without ever facing a courtroom, without ever being made to answer for what had been done to Jane and Danny and Mark and Roth. The grief that accompanies this kind of outcome is different from the grief of losing someone you love. It is a secondary grief, a grief layered on top of the original loss, a grief born of injustice rather than death. The families had already been robbed once, and now they felt robbed again of the closure that a trial might have provided, of the public acknowledgement that their children's lives had mattered enough for someone to be held responsible. The investigation did not stop with Vance's death. The case file remained open. Other names that had been associated with the investigation over the years continued to receive attention. The possibility that there had been other perpetrators, that Vance had not acted alone, that others who were still alive had participated in what happened at the burger chef, was actively considered. The name of a second suspect had surfaced in the investigation at various points. connected to Vance by the information that witnesses had provided. This individual, whose identity has been discussed in various of the case over the years, was also investigated, also subjected to the same careful scrutiny that had been applied to Vance. But the same obstacles that had prevented a prosecution of Vance also complicated any case against this second figure. The evidence was suggestive rather than conclusive. The witnesses had credibility issues. The physical evidence, was not definitively inculpatory. The investigation lingered in this difficult place, suspects identified but not charged, evidence gathered but not sufficient, witnesses available but problematic. Through the late 1990s and into the 2000s. Meanwhile, the case had begun to attract significant attention from outside the official investigation. True crime journalism was evolving rapidly in this period, and the Burger Chef case, with its combination of tragedy, small-town setting, extensive investigation, and lack of resolution, was exactly the kind of story that attracted serious, dedicated reporters and researchers. Books were written. Articles were published, podcasts, as that medium emerged. Devoted episodes and series to the case. Each new treatment of the story brought it to a new audience, generated new tips, and kept the pressure on law enforcement to continue treating the case as active. The attention was both helpful and complicated. Helpful because it kept the case visible, kept the family's pain in the public consciousness, kept the hope alive that someone with relevant information might come forward. Complicated because public coverage of a case can sometimes interfere with an active investigation, can tip off suspects, can compromise witnesses, can introduce misinformation that clutters the informational landscape. The Indiana State Police navigated this attention carefully, maintaining their commitment to the case while managing what they disclosed publicly and what they held back. The families of the victims engaged with journalists and researchers to varying degrees, some finding comfort in the public acknowledgement of their loved ones' stories, others finding the repeated excavation of their grief painful and exhausting. Through all of this, the central fact of the case remained unchanged. 4 people had been murdered. The investigation had produced strong suspicions about who was responsible, but no one had ever been charged, and with the death of the primary suspect, the likelihood of a conventional prosecution had diminished significantly. And yet the case was not over. The case was never truly over. In the 2000s, the Burger Chef murders received another significant infusion of attention, this time driven by advances in forensic science and a renewed commitment within the Indiana State Police to bring cold cases back to active status. Cold case units, which had become standard in many large police departments and state agencies by this period, brought fresh investigators to old files, people who had not been working the case for decades, who could look at the evidence without the accumulated assumptions and fatigue of years of investigation, who might see something that had been overlooked or approach a problem from a direction that had not been tried. The Burger Chef file was thick by this point. Decades of investigation had produced an enormous amount of documentation, interviews, forensic reports, tip records, investigative notes, legal analysis. A new investigator coming to this file would spend weeks or months simply reading and understanding what had already been done before they begin to identify what might be done next. But that process of review sometimes produces results. Fresh eyes catch things that tired eyes have stopped seeing. A detail that had seemed insignificant in 1985 might look complete and different in 2005. In light of information that had emerged in the intervening years, or techniques that had not been available when the detail was first recorded. The renewed attention in the 2000s did not result in an arrest, but it did produce something valuable, a clearer and more public account of where the investigation stood, of what investigators believed had happened, of who they believed was responsible. The Indiana State Police over the years became more willing to discuss the general outlines of their conclusions, to acknowledge that they had strong suspicions about specific individuals, even if those suspicions had not resulted in charges. This partial transparency was meaningful to the families of the victims, who had sometimes felt that the investigation was happening entirely behind closed doors, that they were being kept at arm's length from information about their own children's murders. knowing that investigators believed they knew who was responsible, even if that person could not be prosecuted, was not justice, but it was something. It was acknowledgement. It was the validation that their children's deaths had been taken seriously, had been investigated thoroughly, had not simply been filed away and forgotten. But acknowledgement is not justice. And the families of Jane Freet, Danny Davis, Mark Flemons, and Ruth Ellen Shelton had been waiting for justice for a very long time. The question that haunted the case, that haunts it still, is whether justice will ever come. Whether the investigation will one day produce something it has not yet produced, evidence sufficient for prosecution. A living suspect willing or compelled to answer for what happened, a courtroom moment in which the crime is named, and the perpetrator is held accountable. There are reasons for both hope and despair on this question. Reasons for hope include the continued openness of the case file, the ongoing advances in forensic technology that continue to expand what can be done with old physical evidence, the possibility that someone with knowledge of the crime, someone who has been carrying that knowledge for decades, might finally decide to speak. Reasons for despair include the passage of time, the death of the primary suspect, the aging and dying of potential witnesses, the simple entropy that makes old crimes harder to prosecute with every year that passes. The Burger Chef murders sit in this uncomfortable space, not solved, not forgotten, not abandoned, but suspended in the particular limbo of a case that has come so close to resolution and yet remains, after all these years, without a definitive legal answer. Let us talk now about the specific theories that investigators developed over the decades, the competing accounts of what happened the night of November 17, 1978, and what the weight of the evidence suggests about the truth. The most thoroughly investigated theory, and the one that investigators appeared to give the most credence to by the later years of the case, centered on robbery as the primary motive. Someone, most likely more than one person, came to the Burger Chef that night intending to take the night deposit. The timing of their arrival, the knowledge they appeared to have of the restaurant's closing routines, and the specific targeting of the safe, and the deposit bag all suggested premeditation planning, some degree of inside knowledge or prior observation of the restaurant's operations. The robbery theory holds that the crime escalated beyond what the perpetrators had intended. Perhaps the employees resisted. Perhaps someone panicked. Perhaps one of the perpetrators was more violent than the others anticipated. Or the situation developed in ways that could not easily be controlled once set in motion. Whatever the specific trigger, the situation moved from armed robbery to something far more serious, and the decision was made, in the chaos of that moment, to take the employees rather than leave them as witnesses. This theory aligns with the physical evidence in several important ways. The partial cleaning of the restaurant suggests the closing routine was underway when the intrusion occurred, consistent with a targeted robbery timed to coincide with the preparation of the night deposit. The variation in cause of death, gun, knife, strangulation, blunt force, is consistent with a chaotic scene involving multiple perpetrators rather than a single, controlled execution. The transportation of the victims to a location 30 miles from the restaurant suggests an attempt to put distance between the crime and its discovery, consistent with perpetrators who were trying to manage a situation that had gone badly wrong. The theory also aligns with the information provided by the key witnesses, the informant of the early 1990s and Alita Sims, whose accounts, whatever their credibility issues, consistently pointed toward robbery as the initiating motive and chaos as the mechanism by which it became murder. What the robbery theory does not fully explain is the specific choice of the Burger Chef on Crawfordsville Road. Burger Chef was not the most lucrative target in Speedway or Indianapolis. The night deposit from a single fast food restaurant was not a large sum of money, not the kind of haul that would justify the risk of a violent armed robbery, not the kind of prize that would seem worth the catastrophic consequences that followed. This has led some investigators and researchers to wonder whether the choice of target was driven by something more specific than general opportunity, whether the perpetrators had a particular reason to know about this restaurant, this crew, this specific closing night. The inside knowledge question. who knew enough about the burger chef's operations to time the robbery, as precisely as the evidence suggests it was timed, has never been definitively answered. It remains one of the most persistent and troubling open questions in the case. The alternative theories that have been proposed over the years generally involve variations on this basic framework. Some emphasize the role of a disgruntled former employee or someone with a personal grievance against the restaurant or its management. Some propose a more opportunistic scenario in which the perpetrators stumbled across the restaurant at closing time without specific foreknowledge. Some involve connections to organized criminal networks in Indianapolis that went beyond a simple robbery crew. None of these alternative theories has gathered enough evidence to displace the primary robbery theory, but none has been entirely ruled out either. The case has the quality of a puzzle that has been assembled to the point where the general picture is clear, but several crucial pieces remain missing. What is clear, at the level of broad investigative consensus, is this: 4 young people were murdered in November 1978. The crime was almost certainly carried out by more than one person. Robbery was almost certainly the initiating motive. The perpetrators had some degree of knowledge about the restaurant's operations and schedule. James Herb Vance was the individual investigators came to believe was most centrally involved, and he died without ever being charged. Beyond that, the specifics remain contested, uncertain, and to a significant degree unknown. The years moved forward as they always do. Indifferent to the grief of the families and the frustration of the investigators and the unanswered questions that had accumulated around the burger chef case like sediment around a stone, the 2000s became the 2010s. The children who had been born in Speedway around the time of the murders grew up and had children of their own. The restaurant on Crawfordsville Road had long since changed hands. Burger Chef as a chain ceased to exist in 1996. Absorbed into Hardee's, its orange and brown signage replaced, its name erased from the American fast food landscape as completely as if it had never existed. The physical space where 4 young people had spent their last hours of ordinary life had been transformed into some entirely a different business in a different era, carrying no outward sign of what had happened there. But the case did not disappear. It could not disappear, because the families of the victims were still alive, still carrying their grief, still waiting. Because the investigators who had worked the case in its earlier phases, now retired or approaching retirement, had not forgotten. Because the Indiana State Police kept the file active, kept accepting tips, kept assigning periodic attention to a case that had never been officially closed, and never would be until someone answered for what had been done. And because, in the wider world beyond Indiana, the Burger Chef murders had become something else, had become a story, a case study, a piece of true crime history that drew researchers and journalists and podcasters and curious members of the public who wanted to understand what had happened and why it had never been resolved. The true crime community that developed in the early years of the internet and exploded with the podcast revolution of the 20s found in the Burger Chef case exactly the kind of story that the genre feeds on. A small-town young victims, a massive investigation that went on for decades, a primary suspect who died before he be charged, witnesses whose testimony was compelling but complicated, a case that came agonizingly close to resolution and then stopped just short. These are the ingredients of the kind of crime story that stays with you, that keeps you thinking, that generates the particular frustration and sadness that attaches to a case where justice was almost served but not quite. Multiple podcasts devoted episodes or extended series to the Burger Chef murders. Journalists wrote long-form pieces that traced the investigation from its beginning to its then current state. A book, Scott Schroka's detailed examination of the case, brought the story to a wider audience and provided the most comprehensive public accounting of the investigation that had yet been produced. Each new treatment of the case generated fresh attention, fresh tips to the Indiana State Police tip line, fresh hope in the families that something new would surface. Scott Schroka's work on the Burger Chef case deserves particular mention because it represents the kind of serious, dedicated journalism that cold cases depend on to remain alive in the public consciousness. Schroka spent years researching the case. conducting interviews with investigators and family members and others connected to the events of 1978, obtaining records through public information requests, and constructing the most thorough public account of the investigation that has ever been assembled. His work brought the case to readers who had never heard of the Burger Chef murders and gave those already familiar with the case new details and perspectives. The attention generated by Sroka's work and the broader true crime community's engagement with the case had a measurable effect on the Indiana State Police's engagement with the file. Tips came in. Leads were generated. The investigation, which had been in a relatively quiet phase for several years, received renewed attention from investigators who were aware that the public interest in the case was high, and that there were people out there who might have information they had not yet shared. One of the persistent challenges of the Burger Chef case in its later years was the question of what could still be done forensically. The physical evidence collected in 1978 had been preserved to varying degrees, and the question of whether modern forensic analysis could extract useful information from what remained was one that investigators and forensic scientists worked on carefully over the years. DNA analysis had transformed criminal investigation since its introduction in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Cases that had seemed permanently cold were reopened and solved when DNA from old evidence was tested and matched to a perpetrator. The hope that DNA might do for the Burger Chef case what it had done for other cold cases was real and persistent. Investigators went back to the physical evidence from the crime scene and from the victims' bodies with this question in mind. Was there biological material preserved in the evidence collected in 1978 that could be tested and potentially matched to a suspect? The answer, unfortunately, was complicated. Some material had been preserved adequately for modern testing. Other material had degraded over the decades in ways that made useful analysis impossible. The specific results of forensic retesting in the Burger Chef case have not been fully disclosed publicly. The Indiana State Police have maintained their traditional caution about releasing details of an active investigation. But what has been indicated is that the retesting did not produce the definitive DNA match that would have transformed the case. This is not unusual. Many cases from the pre-DNA era resist the application of modern forensic techniques, not because the evidence was poorly handled but simply because the preservation standards of the 1970s were not designed with decades later DNA analysis in mind. The Burger Chef case sits in this frustrating category, a case where modern forensic science has been applied and has yielded some information, but not the breakthrough that was needed. The investigation also continued to work the witness angle. Over the years, as the primary suspects aged and in some cases died, the web of people connected the case in various ways. People who had known the perpetrators, people who had heard things, people who had been carrying pieces of knowledge for decades, was not static. People's circumstances shifted. Loyalties shifted. The fear that had kept some people silent in the immediate aftermath of the murders, the fear of retaliation from dangerous men, diminished as those men aged and died. Some people who had been unwilling to talk in the 1980s or 1990s became more willing to talk in the 2010s. Investigators pursued these opportunities carefully. Each new conversation with someone connected to the case was an opportunity to add a piece to the puzzle, to corroborate or complicate the existing account, to find the thread that had not yet been pulled. The cold case unit of the Indiana State Police, which handled the Burger Chef file among its many other responsibilities, maintained relationships with individuals in the case's orbit, and monitored for developments that might signal a new willingness to provide information. The families of the victims remained a central presence in the case's ongoing life. They had become, over the decades, something more than simply grieving relatives. They had become advocates, people who used their position as the human face of the case to keep it in the public consciousness, to maintain pressure on investigators and prosecutors, to ensure that the Burger Chef murders were not allowed to slide quietly into the category of officially forgotten. The parents of the victims, those who were still alive, had aged significantly by the 2010s. Some had died without seeing justice achieved. Danny Davis's parents, who had lulled son on a November night in 1978, had spent the intervening decades living with that loss, in the particular way that parents live with the loss of a murdered child, never fully free from it, never able to move entirely past it, the grief becoming part of the architecture of their lives rather than a stage they passed through. The same was true for the families of Jane, Mark, and Ruth. Siblings who had been children themselves in 1978, who had grown up in the shadow of an unsolved murder in the family, were now adults with their own children and their own lives. They had inherited the quest for justice along with the grief, had grown up watching their parents carry the weight of unanswered questions, and had taken on some of that weight themselves. For these siblings, the Burger Chef murders were not a historical event. They were a defining feature of their own personal histories, something that had shaped who they were and how they understood the world. The engagement of these family members with the true crime community, with journalists, with investigators, was an act of courage as much as advocacy. Speaking publicly about the murder of someone you loved, repeatedly and across decades, requires a willingness to remain vulnerable that is not easy to sustain. And yet the families persisted, because the alternative, silence, withdrawal from the public narrative of the case, felt like abandonment of the people they had lost. In the mid-2010s, the Sword and Scale podcast, among others, devoted significant attention to the Burger Chef case, bringing it to an audience of millions of true crime listeners who might never have encountered it otherwise. The podcast format proved particularly well suited to the Burger Chef story. The case's complexity, its multiple suspects, its twists and turns and near misses, translated well to the long-form audio narrative that podcasts excel at. Listeners who heard the case for the first time through these productions were often struck, not just by the tragedy of the victims' deaths, but by the particular cruelty of a resolution that had never come. The tips that came into the Indiana State Police in the wake of major podcast coverage were not trivial. Some were the kind of vague, speculative tips that investigators learned to handle quickly and set aside. Others were more substantial, people who had been living with pieces of information for years and had finally found, in hearing the case presented publicly, the motivation to share what they knew. Whether any of these tips produced actionable intelligence is not publicly known, but investigators have consistently indicated that the case remains active and that new information continues to come in. One of the aspects of the Burger Chef case that has attracted particular attention from researchers and investigators in its later phases is the question of whether there are living individuals who have direct knowledge of the crime and have not yet shared it. This question is impossible to answer with certainty, but the logic of the case suggests that there probably are. The crime involved multiple perpetrators by most accounts. Only one, Vance, was ever identified as a primary suspect. Others who may have been involved, or who were told about the crime by participants, are potentially still alive. They are older now, potentially in declining health, potentially at a point in their lives where the calculus of keeping a secret has shifted. The appeal to potential witnesses that investigators and family members have made repeatedly over the years rests on exactly this logic. If you know something, if you were there, or were told something by someone who was there, or have been carrying a piece of this story for 40-something years, now is the time. The victims' families deserve to know the truth. The 4 young people who died on a November night in 1978 deserve to have their story fully told. And if you have been living with the weight of this knowledge, then telling it is also, in its own way, a kind of release. Whether that appeal will ever produce the breakthrough it is seeking is one of the great open questions of the case. Let us turn now to some of the specific details of the investigation that have become public over the years. The granular particulars that distinguish the Burger Chef case from a general narrative of unsolved murder and give it its specific texture and weight. One of the most discussed details in the public accounting of the case concerns the question of how the perpetrators gained access to the restaurant. As we established early in this story, the back door showed no signs of forced entry. This single fact has been interpreted in multiple ways over the years. The most common interpretation, and the one that aligns most naturally with the inside knowledge theory, is that the perpetrators had a key or were admitted by someone inside. But there is another interpretation that investigators considered seriously, that the back door was simply unlocked because it was being used during the closing routine, and the perpetrators timed their entry to coincide with a moment when the door was open and the crew was occupied with closing tasks. In this version, the lack of forced entry does not indicate a key or inside knowledge so much as careful observation of the restaurant's routines from the outside. Someone who had watched the burger chef through multiple closing shifts would know when the back door was likely to be unlocked, when the crew would be most occupied and least alert, when the moment of maximum vulnerability occurred. This kind of surveillance-based knowledge is different from inside knowledge, but produces the same result: timing a robbery to coincide with the closing routine's most vulnerable moment. This detail, how they got in, connects to the broader question of how much planning went into the crime. The robbery theory holds that there was planning, but the specific nature of that planning has never been definitively established. The difference between a perpetrator with a key and a perpetrator who watched from the parking lot is significant, and it has never been resolved. Another detail that has received significant attention is the route taken from the burger chef to the Johnson County location where the bodies were found. 30 miles south of Speedway, on a rural road, in a stretch of woods that would have been dark and quiet in the early morning hours of a November night. How did the perpetrators know to go there? Did they know the area? Did they choose it randomly by driving until they found somewhere that seemed isolated enough? Was there a connection between the perpetrators and Johnson County that made that specific location a familiar choice? The route and the destination speak to the question of local knowledge. Someone who chose that specific location in Johnson County as a disposal site either knew the area well, had been there before, knew its geography and its quietness, or made an extraordinarily fortuitous choice if they were acting randomly. Investigators have consistently believed that the location choice was not random, that whoever drove those 4 young people to Johnson County knew where they were going. This belief is consistent with the theory that the perpetrators were Indianapolis area residents with knowledge of the rural area south of the city. The specific road, the specific patch of woods. These are the kinds of details that local knowledge produces. You do not end up at a specific remote location in the middle of the night, unless you have a reason to know it is there. This detail has been used over the years to argue for a perpetrator with roots in the area south of Indianapolis, someone who knew Johnson County in the way that people know the areas around their homes. Another piece of the puzzle that has been discussed extensively is the behavior of the perpetrators in the aftermath of the crime. A quadruple murder is not something that leaves no trace in a person's life. The weight of it, the knowledge of what was done, the fear of discovery, the management of that secret over months and years, changes people. It changes their behavior, their relationships, their sense of themselves. People who knew the perpetrators in the years after 1978 would have been living alongside someone carrying an enormous and terrible secret. Investigators have always been interested in this aftermath dimension, in what people in the perpetrators' circles observed in the days and weeks and months after the murders. Were there signs of distress, sudden changes in behavior, increased alcohol or drug use, a new nervousness around police or law enforcement topics? The flight response that sometimes manifests in people who have done something they cannot undo. Some of the witness testimony gathered over the years addressed exactly these questions. People who had known the suspected perpetrators in the late 1970s and early 1980s described behaviors consistent with someone managing a terrible secret, volatility, paranoia, moments of strange intensity around topics connected to the case. This testimony, gathered carefully and documented thoroughly, formed part of the circumstantial case that investigators built against Vance and the other individuals in the investigation's orbit. Circumstantial evidence, it is worth emphasizing, is not weak evidence. The idea that circumstantial evidence is inherently inferior to direct evidence is a common misconception. Circumstantial evidence, a pattern of behavior, a connection to a location, a piece of physical evidence that links a person to a scene, a statement that reveals knowledge only the perpetrator could have, can be enormously powerful in a criminal case. And many of the most successful prosecutions in American history have rested primarily on circumstantial evidence. The problem in the Burger Chef case was not that the circumstantial evidence was weak. The problem was that the central figure it pointed toward was dead. You cannot prosecute a dead man. You cannot bring a dead man into a courtroom and make him answer for what he did. The evidence that had accumulated against James Herb Vance, the witness testimony, the corroborating details, the circumstantial connections, was locked in a file that could no longer lead to a prosecution of its primary target. The question of whether that evidence could support a prosecution of anyone else connected to the case was one that prosecutors examined carefully. If Vance had accomplices, and the evidence strongly suggested he did not act alone, then those accomplices were potentially still liable, potentially still reachable, potentially still living somewhere in Indiana or elsewhere, going about their lives with a secret that had aged alongside them. The challenge was identifying those accomplices with sufficient specificity and building a case against them that did not depend entirely on evidence that primarily implicated Vance. If the case against Vance relied heavily on testimony that pointed to him specifically, then using that same testimony to prosecute a co-conspirator required a different kind of construction, a way of showing that the co-conspirator's involvement was established by the evidence independent of what it established about Vance. This is a genuine legal challenge, and it is one that prosecutors in the Burger Chef case took seriously. The conversations between investigators and prosecutors about what could be done, what they had, were detailed and extended. Legal strategies were developed and evaluated. The question of whether a prosecution was viable, not just morally justified but legally sustainable, was examined from multiple angles. The conclusion that emerged, at least as of the most recent publicly known state of the case, was that a prosecution had not yet been achievable. Not that it was impossible in principle. Not that the evidence did not point powerfully in a specific direction, but that what was available did not yet meet the legal standard required to bring someone to trial for 4 murders. This conclusion has not changed the family's belief that they know, in the broad strokes, what happened to their loved ones. The information that has been shared with them over the years, carefully, with appropriate caution about ongoing investigation, has given them a picture of events that, while not legally proven, feels true to them in a way that provides a partial, painful kind of closure. They know or believe they know who took their children. They know or believe they know why. They do not know and may never know every specific detail of what happened in those hours between the restaurant and the woods. That partial knowledge is its own kind of torment. Better than nothing. Better than the complete darkness of a case with no identified suspect, no theory, no sense of what happened. But far short of the full truth and infinitely short of justice, in 2018, the 40th anniversary of the Burger Chef murders generated a significant wave of renewed attention. 40th anniversaries of major unsolved crimes tend to produce retrospectives, and the Burger Chef case received thorough and thoughtful coverage from Indiana media and from the true crime community more broadly. The coverage brought the story to people who had not been alive in 1978, people for whom the case was history rather than memory, people who encountered it for the first time and felt the particular weight of a crime that had happened to people their own age or younger. The Indiana State Police used the occasion of the anniversary to renew their public appeal for information. They released update information about the case, acknowledged the ongoing investigation, and asked anyone with knowledge of the events of November 17, 1978 to come forward. The tip line received new calls, new leads were generated. Investigators followed up with the diligence that had characterized their work on the case since its beginning. Whether those new tips produced anything of investigative value is not publicly known. The Indiana State Police have maintained, consistently, that the case is active and that new information is always welcome. This is not merely a formality. It is a genuine expression of the investigation's ongoing nature. Its refusal to accept that the absence of a prosecution means the absence of a case. The families marked the 40th anniversary with a mixture of grief and determination. 40 years is an enormous span of time. It encompasses entire lifetimes. The parents who had been in their 30s and 40s in 1978, who had been robbed of their children in the prime of their own lives, were now in their 70s and 80s. Some had died. Some were in declining health. The urgency of the remaining time, the narrowing window in which justice might still be served in a form that the surviving family members could witness, was not something any of them could afford to ignore. The siblings, now middle-aged, carried the advocacy forward. They spoke to journalists, they engaged with the true crime community. They maintained contact with investigators. They had grown up defining themselves partly in relation to this absence, to the brother or sister who was not there, to the case that had shaped their family's history, to the justice that had never come. They were not going to stop, and the case was not going to stop either, because cases like this do not stop. They do not stop as long as families are alive to remember. They do not stop as long as investigators are willing to work them. They do not stop as long as the possibility exists, however remote, however complicated, that someone with knowledge will decide to speak, or that a piece of evidence will yield to a new technique, or that the patient, persistent work of pursuing truth will eventually find what it is looking for. The burger chef murders are 40-something years old now. The restaurant is gone. The primary suspect is dead. The witnesses who were young adults in 1978 are now old and some are gone. The Indiana of 1978, the small-town America of 1978, the world in which 4 teenagers could work a closing shift at a burger restaurant without anyone worrying about their safety, is gone too, replaced by something more complicated and more cautious and more aware of the darkness that can come through an unlocked door. But 4 young people are still waiting. Jane Freed, 20 years old. Daniel Davis, 16. Mark Flemons, 17. Ruth Ellen Shelton, 18. They are still waiting for someone to stand up and answer for what was done to them. And the people who love them are still waiting too. Let me tell you about the moments in this case that have stayed with investigators. The details that experienced detectives, people who have worked many cases over many years, have described as the ones that haunted them most. The ones they thought about at the end of a long day. The ones that came back to them uninvited. The ones that made the burger chef case different from the others in the long catalog of violence that any career in law enforcement accumulates. One of those moments is the partial cleaning. The fact that the restaurant had been only partially cleaned when the perpetrators arrived, that the closing routine was underway but not complete, that there were still tasks being done, means that the 4 young people were busy when they were taken. They were working. They were doing what they came to do, what they had been hired to do, what they did every closing shift without incident. They were not standing idle, not watching the clock, not doing anything other than their jobs. There is something about that detail that is almost unbearable. The ordinariness of it, the simple, unremarkable quality of what they were in the last moments of their ordinary lives. Wiping a counter, counting change, wrapping up the night's work. And then something came through the door and everything ordinary ended. Another detail that has haunted investigators is the variation in cause of death. The fact that these 4 young people died in different ways, by gun, by knife, by strangulation, by blunt force, tells a story of a scene that was chaotic and extended, a scene in which things happened over time rather than in a single quick moment. This was not an instant, clinical termination. This was something that unfolded, that involved real human beings in real struggle, that took time. The time that it took, the duration between when the perpetrators arrived and when the last victim died, is a measure of suffering that investigators have never been able to fully account for, and have never been able to forget. The transportation of the victims is another detail that stays with people. The drive, the 30 miles from Crawfordsville Road and Speedway to the rural road in Johnson County. How long does 30 miles take at night on Indiana roads in November? 20 minutes, perhaps. 30. Long enough for the people in that vehicle, the victims, bound and terrified, with no way to call for help and no way to know what came next, to have understood something about their situation. Long enough for that understanding to have been real and present and terrible. We do not know what was said during that drive, if anything. We do not know whether the victims knew each other well enough to take comfort from each other's presence, or whether fear had reduced each of them to their own private terror. We do not know whether they tried to communicate, tried to plan, tried to find any exit from the situation they were in. We know only that they were alive when they got in that vehicle, and they were dead when they were found in those woods. And the time between those two facts is a space of human experience that no one should ever have to occupy. These are the details that make the Burger Chef case not just a puzzle to be solved, but a tragedy to be mourned. A human story about the specific suffering of 4 specific people and the specific grief of the people who loved them. The investigation matters, the suspects matter, the evidence matters, but they matter because of the human reality that underlies them. Because Jane and Danny and Mark and Ruth were real. Because what was done to them was real. Because the people they left behind are real, and still here and still waiting. The Indiana State Police never stopped working the Burger Chef case. That is not a formality or a comforting fiction, it is a documented reality, confirmed by the continued assignment of investigators to the file, the continued acceptance of tips through the state police tip line, the continued engagement of the cold case unit with evidence and witnesses, and the accumulated documentation of decades of investigation. The case that began on the morning November 18, 1978, when a manager walked into an empty restaurant and reached for the phone, has never officially ended. It has changed shape over the decades, has moved through phases of intensity and relative quiet, has been driven by different investigators with different approaches and different tools, but it has never been closed, never been declared unsolvable, never been allowed to become simply history. This persistence is not accidental. It is the product of a specific institutional commitment to the 4 young people who were murdered, and to the families they left behind, and to the principle that a crime of this magnitude does not simply expire because years have passed and the investigation has not yet produced what it was looking for. The Indiana State Police have a history with this case that goes back to its very beginning. Investigators who worked it in 1978 passed it to investigators who worked it in the 1980s and 1990s, who passed it to cold case specialists who worked it in the 2000s and 2010s. The institutional memory of the case, the accumulated knowledge of what had been tried and what had been found and what remained to be explored, was carefully maintained and carefully transferred across generations of investigators. What that persistence looks like in practice is something that the public does not always see or fully appreciate. It means that when a new tip comes in, even a tip from someone who heard a podcast episode and has a vague sense that a person they once knew said something relevant decades ago, it is taken seriously, logged, followed up. It means that when a new forensic technique becomes available that might be applicable to old evidence, investigators consider whether that technique could be brought to bear on the Burger Chef case's physical record. It means that when someone in the orbit of the suspected perpetrators dies or experiences a major life change, investigators pay attention to whether that change might affect the willingness of others in that orbit to speak. It is slow work. It is frequently discouraging work. It is the kind of work that requires a specific temperament, the ability to sustain engagement with a problem that has resisted solution for a very long time, without losing the precision and care that the work demands. The investigators who have worked the Burger Chef case in its later years are people of that temperament. They have not given up. They have not concluded that the case is beyond resolution. They have continued to believe, based on what the evidence shows them, that the truth of what happened on November 17, 1978 is knowable, and that the work of making it legally actionable is ongoing. The question of forensic advances deserves extended attention at this point in the story, because it is one of the most important and most often misunderstood aspects of cold case investigation. The popular understanding of forensic science, shaped by decades of crime dramas and true crime media, tends toward the dramatic, the single piece of DNA evidence that breaks open a case, the definitive match that identifies a perpetrator beyond any doubt. The reality of forensic science as it applies to cold cases is considerably more complicated and considerably less cinematic. Physical evidence collected in 1978 was collected using the standards and techniques of 1978. The investigators who processed the Burger Chef crime scene and the Johnson County recovery site were skilled professionals working with the tools available to them. They collected what they could identify as relevant. They preserved it as well as the preservation standards of the time allowed. They processed it using the analytical techniques that existed. And then they stored it, and time went to work on it in the way that time works on everything. 40+ years of storage changes biological evidence in ways that can be significant or subtle or both. Temperature fluctuations, humidity, exposure to air, the simple passage of time. All of these factors affect the integrity of biological samples in ways that may or may not be recoverable using modern analytical techniques. Some evidence that was collected in the 1970s has survived in a condition that allows for DNA extraction and analysis. Other evidence has degraded beyond the point where useful information can be obtained. Investigators in the Burger Chef case went back to the physical evidence repeatedly over the years, applying each new generation of forensic technology to the question of what could be learned. Touch DNA analysis, which allows for the extraction of genetic material from surfaces that a person has merely touched, was not available in 1978, but became a powerful tool in cold case investigations in later years. Low copy number DNA analysis, which can work with extremely small or degraded biological samples, has extended the reach of forensic science and evidence that older techniques could not process. Familial DNA searching, which identifies potential suspects by matching partial DNA profiles to relatives in law enforcement databases, has produced breakthroughs in cases where a direct match to the perpetrator was not available. Each of these techniques was considered in the context of the Burger Chef case. Each was applied where applicable. The results, as we have noted, were not publicly disclosed in detail, consistent with the investigation's long-standing practice of maintaining confidentiality about specific evidentiary matters. But investigators have indicated that the forensic retesting provided information without producing the definitive breakthrough that would have transformed the case's legal status. The genealogical DNA technique that gained enormous public attention following the identification of the Golden State Killer in 2018 is worth discussing specifically in the context of the Burger Chef case. Investigative genetic genealogy, the use of consumer DNA databases to identify relatives of an unknown subject whose DNA was found at a crime scene, has produced remarkable results in cold cases across the country. Cases that sat unsolved for decades have been broken open by this technique when forensic DNA from a crime scene was matched to distant relatives of the perpetrator whose DNA appeared in public genealogy databases, allowing investigators to work down the family tree to identify the individual who committed the crime. The applicability of this technique to the Burger Chef case depends on several factors that are not fully known publicly. It requires first that there be a viable DNA profile extracted from the crime scene evidence, a profile attributed to the perpetrator or perpetrators rather than to the victims. It requires that this profile be complete enough for database searching, and it requires either that a relative of perpetrator has uploaded their DNA to one of the relevant consumer databases, or that law enforcement databases contain a partial match. Whether these conditions are met in the Burger Chef case has not been publicly confirmed. Investigators have not disclosed whether there is perpetrator DNA from the scene, whether that DNA has been profiled, or whether genealogical searching has been attempted or has produced results. This silence is consistent with an ongoing active investigation, the kind of information that, if disclosed publicly, could affect the behavior of suspects or witnesses or others connected to the case. What can be said is that if usable perpetrator DNA exists in the Burger Chef case's evidence record, then investigative genetic genealogy represents the most powerful tool currently available for identifying an unknown perpetrator. The technique has worked in cases far older and far more forensically challenging than the Burger Chef case. If the physical evidence supports it, it is a path that investigators would pursue with everything available to them. The parallel evolution of forensic science and cold case investigation is one of the most significant developments in criminal justice of the past 30 years. Cases that were committed before the DNA era are being revisited with tools that their original investigators could not have imagined. Some of those cases are being solved, others are not. The Burger Chef case sits in a category of its own, a case where investigators believe they know who was responsible, where the primary suspect is dead, and where the question is whether evidence exists to support a prosecution of any remaining living individual who may have been involved. This is a different kind of forensic challenge from the classic cold case scenario in which the perpetrator is unknown and the goal of forensic analysis is identification. In the Burger Chef case, the goal of forensic analysis is not identification of an unknown, but corroboration of what is already known, confirmation that the people investigators believe were responsible were in fact at the scene, in the restaurant, in the vehicle, in the woods. That kind of corroboration, if it could be established forensically, would transform the legal landscape of the case dramatically. The search for that corroboration is part of what has driven the case's ongoing forensic work. And the hope that it might yet be found is part of what keeps the investigation alive, beyond the forensic dimension. The Burger Chef case in its later years has been shaped significantly by the broader cultural phenomenon of cold case interest and the specific dynamics of the true crime community. We have touched on this already, but it deserves deeper examination, because the relationship between true crime media and active cold case investigations is complex and not always well understood. True crime as a genre has existed for as long as crime has existed. People have always been drawn to stories of violence and mystery and the human capacity for darkness. But the specific form it has taken in the internet age, and particularly in the podcast era that began in the mid-2010s, has transformed the relationship between public audiences and active investigations in ways that are genuinely new. The audience for true crime media is enormous and engaged. Millions of people listen to true crime podcasts, read true crime books, watch true crime documentaries. They become genuinely invested in the cases they follow, develop nuanced understandings of the evidence and the investigations, and sometimes, this is the part that matters most to actual investigations, bring relevant information to the attention of law enforcement. The Burger Chef case has benefited from this dynamic in measurable ways. People who heard the case presented on a podcast or read about it in an article and recognized a connection to a name that had been mentioned, to a detail that matched something they had witnessed or been told, have reached out to investigators. Some of these outreaches have been useful. Some have led nowhere. But the volume of public engagement with the case has maintained a level of investigative attention that might not otherwise exist, and has created pathways for information to reach investigators that would not have been available in earlier eras. The challenge, from an investigative standpoint, is managing this engagement productively. The true crime community's appetite for information sometimes conflicts with an investigation's need to control what is publicly known. Details that investigators have carefully held back, the markers of genuine knowledge that distinguish a credible witness from someone constructing a plausible story, can be compromised by public disclosure. The line between transparency that serves the investigation and transparency that compromises it is one that investigators walk carefully. The Indiana State Police have been generally thoughtful in how they engage with the true crime community's interest in the Burger Chef case. They have maintained their commitment to confidentiality about specific evidentiary matters while being willing to confirm the broad outlines of the investigation's conclusions, to acknowledge the ongoing nature of the case, and to direct public interest toward the tip line where it can be most useful. This approach reflects an understanding that the public interest in the case is an asset to be managed rather than a problem to be suppressed. The families of the victims have navigated this same terrain from their own position. Engaging with journalists and podstars and researchers means agreeing to have your grief examined in public, to have the details of your loved one's deaths discussed by strangers, to be part of a story that serves the purposes of an audience as well as the purposes of your own advocacy. Some family members have found this engagement meaningful and even healing in its way, the sense that the people they lost are remembered, that their stories matter to others, that the public outcry for justice has a human face and a human voice. Others have found it exhausting and sometimes traumatizing, the constant excavation of something that never fully heals. There is no single right way to be a family member of a murder victim whose case remains unsolved. The Burger Chef families have found their own ways through it, their own balances between engagement and protection, their own methods of sustaining the search for justice without losing themselves in it. What is consistent across all of them, across the decades and the different family members, and the different ways they have engaged with the case, is the refusal to accept that what happened to Jane and Danny and Mark and Ruth is simply a tragedy without accountability. That the 4 young people who went to work on a Friday night in November 1978 and never came home can simply be mourned and remembered, and then filed away are the heading of things that happened, but were never explained. The families will not accept that. They have never accepted it, and their refusal to accept it is one of the reasons the case is still alive. Let us talk about the specific moment of transformation in the Burger Chef case, the moment that came closest to breaking it open, and examine it in the detail it deserves, because it is the emotional and investigative peak of this long story, and it has never been fully told in public. The information that emerged in the early 1990s, which we discussed in earlier parts of this story, pointed investigators toward James Herb Vance with a specificity that changed the character of the investigation fundamentally. Before that information surfaced, the case had been driven largely by general suspect categories: people with robbery histories, people with connections to the area, people who fit the broad profile of the crime. After it surfaced, the investigation had a name. A specific human being who the evidence suggested had been in that restaurant on the night of November 17, 1978. Working from that name, investigators built a picture of Vance that was detailed and damning. His criminal history was extensive. His presence in the Indianapolis area in the fall of 1978 was documented. His connections to individuals who fit the profile of potential accomplices were real. And the information that Alita Sims provided, the account that placed Vance in the context of the crime with specific, non-public details, was in the view of experienced investigators, compelling evidence of genuine knowledge. The work that investigators did in the years following the identification of Vance as the primary suspect was among the most intensive and thorough of the entire case's history. They were not simply building a general picture. They were trying to build a legal case, gathering evidence with prosecution specifically in mind. Working with prosecutors to understand what would be needed in court, identifying the specific evidentiary gaps that needed to be filled and finding ways to fill them. This kind of investigation with prosecution in mind has a different character from the broader exploratory investigation that had characterized the case's earlier phases. It is more focused, more disciplined, more constrained by the legal standards that evidence must meet to be admissible and persuasive in a courtroom. It is also, in its own way, more frustrating, because the gap between what investigators believe to be true and what they can prove to the legal standard required for conviction is often significant, and that gap does not close easily. The investigators who worked this phase of the Burger Chef case knew what they believed. They had the testimony of witnesses who claimed knowledge of Vance's involvement. They had the circumstantial connections between Vance and the crime. They had a picture of a man whose history and character and associations were consistent with someone who had done what the evidence suggested he had done. What they needed was the bridge from that belief to legal proof, and building that bridge was slow, careful, painstaking work that ultimately did not reach its destination before Vance died. The death of Vance was a blow from which the prosecution-focused phase of the investigation did not fully recover. The legal architecture that had been constructed with him as the central defendant could not simply be redirected to prosecute someone else without significant rebuilding. The evidence that implicated him, the witness testimony, the circumstantial connections, the corroborating details, had to be examined afresh for what it established about any remaining living individuals connected to the crime. And here the investigation found itself in a genuinely difficult position. The evidence strongly suggested that Vance had not acted alone. the nature of the crime, the control required to manage 4 people, the logistics of moving them from the restaurant to the vehicle to the disposal site, strongly suggested multiple perpetrators. But the evidence that identified Vance as a central figure did not automatically extend to the identification of his accomplices with the same specificity. Witnesses who had spoken about Vance's involvement had sometimes mentioned other individuals, but with less consistency and less specific detail. The picture of the crime that emerged from the cumulative witness testimony placed Vance at its center, but left the Eggers present, but less clearly defined, their specific roles less clearly established, their identities sometimes named and sometimes not. This blurriness, this gradation from certainty about the central figure to uncertainty about the peripheral ones, is characteristic of crimes that are described by witnesses years after the fact, by people whose knowledge is partial and whose accounts are colored by time and self-interest and the inherent imprecision of human memory. It does not mean the witnesses were lying or that their information was worthless. It means that the information they provided had limits, and those limits became more significant once the investigation could no longer use that information to prosecute its primary target. The investigation in the years since Vance's death has been working within these limits, trying to find ways around them, trying to find new evidence or new witnesses that might establish more clearly what the surviving individual's roles were, trying to build something that could support a prosecution that the death of the primary suspect had not closed off entirely. Whether that work has produced anything remains, as of now, a matter of official silence. The Indiana State Police have not announced an arrest. They have not publicly declared an individual as a current suspect in the case. The tip line remains active. The case file remains open, and the families remain waiting. There is one more dimension of the Burger Chef case that deserves full examination before we move toward the end of this story. It is the dimension that is hardest to discuss, the psychological and moral dimension of a crime that was never formally attributed to anyone, and what that means for the people involved. For the perpetrators if they are alive, if there are individuals walking through the world today who participated in what happened at the Burger Chef on November 17, 1978, the passage of 40-something years has not erased what they did. It has only placed distance between the act and the present. The psychological literature on people who commit serious violent crimes and are never caught suggests a range of outcomes. Some people are consumed by guilt, haunted by what they did in ways that shape every subsequent year of their lives. Others develop elaborate mechanisms of denial and rationalization that allow them to compartmentalize the crime and continue functioning without confronting it directly. Others simply move on, in a manner that speaks to a capacity for moral detachment that most people find almost incomprehensible. We do not know which of these paths the surviving participants in the Burger Chef murders have followed. We do not know whether in their quiet moments, they think about Jane Freet and Danny Davis and Mark Flemons and Ruth Ellen Shelton. We do not know whether the weight of what they did has been carried openly, or buried deeply, or both at different times over the decades. We do not know whether the growing public attention to the case, the podcasts, the articles, the renewed investigative interest, has affected them, has made them nervous, has caused them to revisit decisions they made about whether to come forward or stay silent. What we know is that the truth of what happened on that November night exists somewhere in the world. It exists in the physical evidence that investigators have collected and preserved and continue to analyze. It exists in the memories of people who were there, or who were told what happened by people who were there. It exists in the institutional memory of the Indiana State Police, in decades of investigation files that document everything that was learned and everything that remains to be established. And it exists in some form, in the consciousness of whoever did this. Because you do not kill 4 people and then forget it. You do not simply set that down and walk away clean. The memory of it goes with you, wherever you go for as long as you live. The truth is out there. The question that remains, the question that has remained for more than 4 decades, is whether it will find its way into a courtroom before the last person with first-hand knowledge of it is gone. The Burger Chef murders have never been solved. Not officially. Not in the way that matters most, with a conviction, with a defendant standing in a courtroom and being held accountable, with a verdict that says clearly and publicly that what was done to Jane Freet and Danny Davis and Mark Flemons and Ruth Ellen Shelton was a crime committed by a specific person or persons who have been named and punished. That accountability has never come. And for the families who have spent more than 4 decades waiting for it, that absence is its own particular and enduring wound. But here is what we can say. 4 young people went to work on a Friday night in November 1978 and were taken from the world by someone who decided their lives were worth less than the contents of a cash register. They were 17 and 16 and 18 and 20 years old. They had done nothing wrong. They had simply shown up for work the way good people do, and the darkness came for them. They deserved better. They deserved justice. They deserved to grow old. Their names were Jane Freet, Daniel Davis, Ruth Ellen Shelton. Remember them. If you have any information about the Burger Chef murders, the Indiana State Police tip line remains open. The case is active. The families are still waiting. And somewhere out there, the truth still exists, waiting to be spoken by someone who has been carrying it long enough. How could someone do this? How could someone look at 4 young people, children really, in the case of the teenagers, and decide that their lives were worth nothing? The world still struggles to understand this level of cruelty, and perhaps it always will. Perhaps some darkness is simply beyond explanation, beyond understanding, beyond anything that reason can reach. What we can do is remember. What we can do is say their names. What we can do is refuse to let them be forgotten. This case reminds us that evil can hide in plain sight, that it can come through an locked door on an ordinary night, and that justice, when it is denied, leaves a wound that does not close. Thank you for listening tonight. If you enjoyed the case, please leave a comment and subscribe. Good night, and stay safe.